according to...
Welcome everybody to our fourth workshop, which will be on the topic history of women's movement on Iceland. And I would like to welcome Brynhildur from Icelandic's Women's Rights Association, which is organizing these workshops together with us, CESI, under the project Working Women, Gender Equality at the Workplace. So Brynhildur is Secretary General of the oldest, if I understand correctly, Women's Rights Association. And we are looking very forward to very much to find more about the history of women's movement in Iceland. So Brynhildur, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen with a slideshow. This works. Does this work full screen for you guys? Yeah. Super. So I've basically entitled my talk "Women's Strikes and Feminist Bureaucracy: Another Tales from the North," other told tales from the North. And I think sort of like it encapsulates the way I view feminism and the story of the women's movement very clearly. In fact, that it is a mixture of radical grassroots activism that is driving the movement forward, and then feminist bureaucracy is sort of like all these women who are now working within our institutions and within our companies, who are doing each their bit in changing the way society works, sort of like. And we cannot change society without either one of those working in concert together. So, and I found it sort of like a very apropos title for that, because of for that. So I want to begin my talk by showing you the local. This is the Global Gender Gap Index report. It came out less than a month ago. And it says that Iceland is, again, and I think it's for the 12th year in a row on the top. But I want to focus your attention on one aspect of this, and it's the figure 0.877, and it's basically saying that what this number means is that according to this one criterion, we've reached 88% equality, and 88% equality, you know, isn't equality. It's inequality. So the way I want to view the Global Gender Gap Index is that it's just an indicator. It doesn't say anything about how good we are in Iceland in terms of gender equality and women's rights. It says more about maybe where other countries have it are worse. We still have a lot of work to do in Iceland to close this gap. But we have. But that being said, we have created tools, and we have that are being used in Iceland to that do secure the status of women, now that do sort of like close the gender, or like do ensure that we have a gender equal society. And so what I want to do is sort of like today is that I want to maybe give you a short overview of how we managed to get these tools into operation. Basically a short overview of the women's history in Iceland, and then just a quick look at some of the key measures that I feel are most important in making sure that we remain a gender equal society. So I want to begin a long time ago, in 1907. This is sort of like, this was the year that women won the right to vote in local elections. You know what, when I first created this slide, I actually wrote women received the right to vote in local election, but you know, it wasn't that we didn't received it. We fought for it and we won it in 1907. And these four ladies who are there on my screen, they are the one who is at the bottom left. Her name was Bryet. She's actually the founder of the organization that I worked for, one of the premier suffragists in Iceland. She was one of the driving forces in the first movement of the women's movement here in Iceland. But what happened in Iceland was that in 1907, once women won the right to vote in local elections, Briette and her friends who were active in the women's movement, they decided that sort of like they desperately wanted to have women then join the local council here in Reykjavik. And so they asked the political parties at the time if they could join their parties and run for office. All of them said no. So what they did was that they formed their own party, the original women's party here in Iceland. And what they did is that they did this very carefully. They organized all the women. So what they did, they knocked on the doors of every woman, of every household in Reykjavik, and asked to speak to the new voters, asked to speak to the women who were there for the first time getting the right to vote. And they were talking to sort of like just explaining what they were running for. And also, doing sort of like holding public lectures. They were training the new voters, telling them sort of like how you could go to the voting booth, what happens when you're going to the voting booth. And by the time the elections came up, they actually won the biggest share of the city council and became the majority. So all four of them, sort of like there were four women running, and all four of them came into office. So it sort of like shows us the importance of organized action, sort of like that once you receive the right to vote, if you organize, you can sort of like seize political power. And that really was the beginning of sort of like what happened in the century to follow. In 1915, we won the right to vote.
Bryn, sorry, we can't see the slides moving. Sorry.
You can't see the slides moving?
No.
No. Oh, okay. What's happening? So
you would like to see this women.
You want to? Oh, wait. Okay. Do you see them now?
Yes. Great.
All right.
Super,
okay.
Thank you. Sorry, move on.
We have now confirmed that screen sharing full share works, but screen sharing the reading version doesn't work. Yeah, so on the bottom left, you can see that here Brynhildur Heiðar, then you have and Katrín and Þórunn and Guðrún, the other ones, and they were all, by the way, they were all active in the women's. They were leaders in specific women's organizations that were active at the time. So these were women coming from the grassroots level of the old sort of like women's societies of the 19th century. Because obviously, the right to vote, like even if I start the story there, it's following decades of organized activist work by women across the country. So here is the 1915 when we basically won the right to vote in parliamentary elections. So if we move from, we can now also run for office, and not only on the city level, but also on the national level. Here is the first woman who was elected to Alþingi, the Icelandic parliament. Her name was Ingibjörg Bjarnason. She was elected in 1922, and similarly, also with this, it was the same story as what happened in 1907. None of the political parties in Iceland wanted to actually put women on the ticket. And so it ended with the same women organizing a specific women's slate to run. So Ingibjörg could run for this women's slate, and she did. And she became a parliamentary member and was elected to parliament as a part of a specific women's slate. And this is actually very indicative of what's going on in the first decades, is that the political parties were not open for women's participation. So they created their own vehicles, and every single woman who was elected into the office for the first 3-4 decades was elected as a part of a specific women's slate. And this actually continued. So this is 1971. This was actually a big breakthrough in 1971. There were 3 women elected to parliament. It was a breakthrough because in the decades before, between 1915 and 1971, we never had more than 2 women in parliament. We either had 1, 2, or like for one glorious term, 0. So we started with a bang, but sort of like then the progress stalled. Obviously, we had the Great Depression. There were 2 world wars. There was the very conservative 50s, where like with the strong impetus of putting women back into the household. But sort of like by the time it's 1971, there is a breakthrough that we have 3 women elected to Alþingi, and so this is, and when I was born in 1978, and I'm a young woman, there were still only 3 women in Alþingi at the time, 3 women out of 63 parliamentary members, which means that we only had 5% representation. And by this time, by the 70s, this means that So in the this means that in the 70s, that meant that Iceland had fallen considerably behind the rest of the other countries in Western Europe at the time, where women's political participation had grown considerably. So Iceland was at that time at the very bottom level for the region. So if you look at the other Nordic countries at the time, they had already reached 20-25% representation, but we were hovering around 5%. But things really started moving in the 80s, and this, of course, in 1980, we have a woman first elected president in Iceland, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir. And I actually might amend this slide. It was obviously glorious. She has been a role model to all of us, and a lot of the progress that we have had in Iceland, we can trace to the fact that we have had her as a role model. That's sort of like to see a woman in one of the highest office in the land. It does have an effect. However, we must remember that her role is a ceremonial one. The presidential role doesn't really have effective power, but just the sheer fact that she was elected was incredibly important. That being said, she is still the only woman who has served as president in Iceland. She left office in 1996 after serving 16 years, and we haven't had a woman since. So we love her. She was a great, but her election was a great milestone. So that's why she's here on the slide. So here is the perhaps real political breakthrough. This is in 1983. So at this point, I'm 5 years old, and basically women are fed up at that time. Sort of like, they look at the past decades of what's been going on in Iceland, that we still have only 5% representation in parliament. So in 1982, a group of women decide to emulate the women, or the original women in the first decade of the century, and they run for office in local elections on specific women's alliance parties, and they win, where they win some local seats. And then in 1983 we see parliamentary elections that they decide to do the same thing. So they form the Women's Alliance, which is very explicitly a feminist party. It's a women's only party with a very feminist agenda. It doesn't have a hierarchical structure. So, and they basically that year in the elections, 9 women are elected to parliament instead of 3. It's not only that they got, I think, 3 or 4 members elected into parliament, it was also just the sheer fact of their existence pushed the other political parties to do the right thing. They realized that they can no longer just run men for office, because they need to show at least to show some diversity. So it's incredibly important. So that's sort of like we have these pressure points, and we have sort of like women, running into sort of like these political spaces, because its impact not only sort of like your participation, but your very existence sort of like drives changes in other parts of the organization. So here's another breakthrough, 2009. So we've seen sort of like this is the year we finally broke the glass ceiling in Alþingi, and that's you can see. So from 83 to 2009, that's almost 30 years. So it took us 30 years to break the glass ceiling of 30% in Alþingi. So we started climbing, but it took a very, very long time. But in 3 decades, we broke it. And you can see here on the slides pictures of vigorous protests from Icelanders that are very upset to see women have so much power. I'm kidding. You're all muted. No, this is obviously, you see the year is 2009. Sorry, I see the shock to the people who have their screens open. I'm like, what? Everyone's on mute. No. 2009, what's going on? It's the financial crisis, right? And what happened in Iceland obviously was catastrophic. We see the whole banking system in Iceland just collapsed. Like every single financial institution went belly up. The government collapsed. Bankruptcy, protest, fear, and protest. So what happens in elections that you hold in a year when this is going on? People want to vote for something new, right? And who were not to blame? And who were the people to blame for the financial crisis? It wasn't, I'm just going to say it, it was men. And we know this in Iceland because we did the parliament commissioned an analysis of the financial crisis in Iceland and what caused it. And one part of this analysis was a gender analysis showing that, and it basically was showing that it showed that in all of the financial institutions in Iceland, there were 0 women at the top, 0 women at the board, 0 women in top management. Like women did not have a seat at the table, and this was the conclusion of the report was that this was at least in part a cause of the crisis. So we break the glass ceiling, and I'm thinking, yay, 2009. And that was also the year we had our first prime minister elected, Johanna. And it's sort of like it is sad that it took a global financial crisis for us to finally break the glass ceiling and elect a female prime minister. But it's also sort of like, it does show us that sort of like when society is in great turmoil and when there are great changes, it is possible to seize a moment, especially if you have an organized grassroots movements already that has already set the stage to using that moment as a moment for change. And this maybe offers us some guidelines into what we can do and think about now as we are moving into a post-COVID period. And you can see here, and this is the current Prime Minister, Katrín Jakobsdóttir. She's the second woman now elected Prime Minister. And I love this picture of her. It's taken last year in 2020. And it's a picture of her on a Zoom meeting with other women world leaders. So these are sort of like they organized a meeting between sort of like all the women who were heads of state or heads of government around the world, and they were basically discussing COVID from their viewpoint. And I would have loved to be a fly on the wall on that conversation, because it's just and just the sheer fact that a meeting like this can take place now is just so it causes me great optimism. Same. So yeah, and so here's this is I mean, I love this, but it's also a very sad graph. You can see this is sort of like this is a graph that I made, and these are basically you can see here very clearly the number of women in the Icelandic parliament since 1916. 1916 is the first election when women were allowed to run and vote in parliamentary election. And so you can see here in 1916 that sort of like you have 0, then you have 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and then it goes to 1942, goes back down to 0, and then you have 2 suddenly in 49. Goes back to 0 and 53, right? So you're seeing, and then, oh my God, 3 in 1971. But you see sort of like once it jump starts in 1983, it continues climbing. But it isn't until 2009 that it finally breaks the 40% barrier. So, and you can see that now in the latest election, it did go down again. So we have to be aware, like that, even if we start climbing, we need to make sure that we keep. We always have to be on guard that we do not lose the progress that we have made. And sort of like we are facing parliamentary elections now in Iceland, and this is one of our top priorities, to make sure that sort of like we again reach the almost 50% representation that we had for a short time here in 2016. Again, also something that I want to emphasize when looking at this graph, you see sort of like just the sheer blueness of it, right? You see that sort of like, and when we're looking at this graph, we're looking at basically the legislative history of a society of Iceland. So for a century, sort of like this is the legislative body that has written all the laws, most of the laws that we have to obey, that sort of like that regulate how our society works. And this is legislation that has been primarily written by men and from a male viewpoint, and without the input of women. So this is also something that I like to think about when we're thinking about sort of like, our legislation, is that this is like, what's this, that we need to, this is in a way a visual presentation of a patriarchy, right? Like this is sort of like the legislative framework created by men, and it's going to take a long time for us to sort of like rewind and to sort of like rewrite all the legislation that is now underpinning the way we live our lives, so that it can be a more gender equal. So, and we here in Iceland are only at the very beginning stages of this, again, because we've only had a fairly gender equal parliament for 10 years. And that's when you look at it, it's such a short time in our history. So, and here is another representation, sort of like what it means to have a gender equal parliament. So I looked over sort of like some impactful legislations that the Icelandic parliament has passed. That my criterion was that those legislations that they had a great effect on gender equality and raising the status of women. And so here you can see sort of like some key pieces of legislation that passed in the first century, like until we broke the glass ceiling. So 1911, equal access to education and public office. 1915, women's suffrage. 61, see, it takes 40 years, the first Equal Pay Act. 75, right to abortion is added to the law with restrictions. 75, maternity is given to all women. It had been restricted before. 76, we had a first comprehensive gender equality act. 95, gender equality is added to the constitution. It hadn't been there before. 2000, we had equal parental leave for women and men, and 2008, you had a second comprehensive gender equality act. So this is what nine key pieces of legislation in 90 years. So it's like once, let's just say rough, like one per decade. These are legislations that are coming from a parliament that is primarily composed of men. Now let's see what happens when women break the glass ceiling. These are key pieces of legislation that have been passed in the past decade since we broke the glass ceiling. I'm just going to go over it shortly. It's just the difference. So 2009. We ban pimping, and this is pimping and the purchase of prostitution is banned. This is the so-called Nordic model. 2010, gender quotas for boards of companies with more than 50 employees. 2010, employers can no longer profit from the nudity of employees, i.e. commercialized stripping is illegal in Iceland. It means that it doesn't mean that stripping is illegal. If I wanted to, I could totally strip here right now because I'm just profiting from it. But if my boss, my president would go like, say, oh, Brynhildur, you need to strip, like that would be illegal. But right, 2010, Gender Neutral Marriage Act, right, gay marriage. 2011, police are given authority to remove domestic violence offenders from the home. 2012, law guaranteeing the right of trans people. 2012, equal pay standard introduced on a voluntary basis. 2015, law requiring government budget to be gender sensitive. 2018, the equal pay standard is made mandatory for all employees with 25 or more employees. 2018, rape redefined based on a lack of consent. 2019, laws liberalizing abortion, women's choice until the 22nd week, which is the current legislation. 2019, a laws guaranteeing gender autonomy. This is sort of like for trans and non-binary people. 2019, equality matters are moved from sort of like the sub-ministries into the prime ministry in recognition of just that the underpinning of its importance to our society. 2020, equal parental leave, 6 months tied to each parent. 2020, new comprehensive equality legislation, including 3 genders, women, men, and people with gender neutral registration. 2000 and, oh, sorry, I said 2020, it's supposed to be 2021. These are laws that have passed in the past couple of months. 2021, laws on stalking. 2021, laws on online violence. This is aka the revenge porn. And so you see, and when you compare it, right, like this is the first century in a parliament without women. This is the last decade where women had fairly equal representation because power in the end matters. It matters that we have women in positions of power that are defining the conversation. And the thing is sort of like, and it is my firm belief and my firm opinion is that it changes the conversation, like that the sheer amount of changes that these women have made in such a short amount of time, it's at this point impossible to stop. They have permanently shifted the conversation. It will be incredibly difficult for us as a society to have a backlash from where we are at this point. So power matters. So this is what we do as an organization. We really want to focus on getting women into political power everywhere that we can, because we've seen we've seen concretely the result that it has had here in Iceland by focusing on that issue. Yeah. So how do we do that? It's gender. I just wanted to let you know, gender quotas are not mandated in elections or political parties. We have now 8 political parties represented in the parliament. 4 of them have internal rules to guarantee equal representation, but 4 of them do not. And this reason and the reason. And we recently changed our mind. We as an organization, we saw that we had made this progress without sort of like agitating for mandatory quotas in the political system. But when we saw sort of like the drop in the last election from when we went from 48% to 38% overnight, and the reason was that we saw 2 new parties running for parliament that did not have internal rules, and they won big, with only men. So mostly men. So the drop was primarily due to those new parties gaining power without having had to think about sort of like any sort of equal representation. So we have now changed our mind as an organization and are now advocating that this be put into election law. That's sort of like we need to institute some gender quotas or some requirements for political parties to have at least a plan on how to make sure that their representation is more equal. Right here, but yeah, so, and I'm just going to, because I know that I've been, I'm just going to go very quickly over just some tools that we have found to be useful. So these are some tools that have been instituted sort of like as a part of this movement, that the laws that the laws that the women and the men in the parliament have passed in the past 10 years. Now enshrined since 2008 in legislation are gender quotas in governmental committees. This means that sort of like appointed committees in national and local government councils and boards. Basically, we should have equal representation of men and women as possible, and no lower than 40%. And with our new inclusive legislation, it means that it basically said that this does not exclude the nomination of people with gender-neutral registration, but enshrines into law the recognition that women have historically been underrepresented by stating very firmly that the ratio of women shall never go below 40%. Corporate responsibility, as I briefly mentioned, we have companies and institutions with an average of 50 employees or more on an annual basis. The board of directors shall be sort of like women shall not go below 40%. Again, this is something we want to see change. This was one of the first quotas that was enacted in Iceland, and at the time they felt it was necessary to have 50 employees or more. But so one of the changes that we are advocating for is that we want this to apply also to companies and workplaces with 25 or more employees to be in line with other gender legislation in Iceland. So there are always sort of like there are always improvements to be made, and this is one of them that we want to see made. Also, what we have found, but I don't have time to go into it now, is that this has not had the effect that we would have wished to see on the companies themselves. Sort of like we have not seen an as dramatic a rise in the number of women who are serving as hired like in executive officers within these companies. So we have laws mandating the boards of these companies, but not sort of like interfering with the executive office. And the corporate world in Iceland has not been as amenable to gender equality, making the changes necessary as the political world has been. And so this is definitely one of the things that we are going to have to working on in the future. And here is sort of like gender action plans. And this is actually just a very short piece. This is just one short article in our Gender Equality Act, and it basically says that all institutions and enterprises with 25 or more employees shall set themselves a gender equality program or mainstream gender equality perspective into their personnel policies. This shall specifically include a statement of aims with a plan how they are to be achieved in order to guarantee employees' rights. And these are rights, for example, that to sort of like have time with their families and etc. And and this text is sort of like, okay, sure, it doesn't sound like much, but in my opinion, this is actually one of the more important pieces of legislation, because what this means is that when you require companies or workplaces to have a plan like this, you need to hire people who can write a plan and implement that plan. And what does this mean? You need to hire feminists, right? Or you need to hire people with gender studies knowledge. And actually, sort of like one of the best thing about living in Iceland is that sort of like when you go to the university and you study gender studies, this is actually to make you more employable. As not a lot of countries in the world that can actually say this, but because of legislations and requirements like this, having a gender studies degree is actually incredibly useful, because this is the way sort of like we are organizing our society, is that this is useful knowledge, because this is the knowledge that we're using to sort of like rebuild our society. The equal pay standard, again, sort of like I'm not going to go very much into it, because I know we have had already this week a workshop on the equal pay standard, but this is obviously a huge innovation in Iceland that we are very eager, sort of like that we've already seen making great changes in Iceland. It can definitely be improved, but it's just a game changer when you think about it, because everywhere else in the world, like, I mean, I think I'm not lying when I say that every country in the world bans pay discrimination on paper, right? But the way it works obviously is that employees need to number one, find out that they're being discriminated against, and then number two, find the resources to do something about it. You need sort of like you need the emotional resources to actually to go against your boss, your company, to complain. And if the complaint is not taken, you need sort of to have like the emotional support, or like social support and financial resources to actually to sue that company. And if sort of like you sue the company and you get and the company is fined, the benefit only goes to you. It doesn't go to your colleague who's sitting next in the next office, or the next table, and this also being discriminated against. That person is also being discriminated against. So what the equal pay standard does, and the fact that we are now requiring companies to get certification based on the standard every 3 years, it shifts the burden of proof to where it belongs, onto the employer, right? It's no longer up to the employee to make sure that they're not being discriminated against. It's where the blame is now, the burden is now where it always should have been, on the workplaces themselves, on the employers, that they need to prove that they are fulfilling the ban on pay discrimination in Iceland. And when you think about it, we passed our first equal pay law in 1951, and we still have a gender pay gap, and it's because companies and institutions have been breaking that law with impunity for 70 years now, but no longer. Hopefully, knock on wood. Right, equal pay, right. So I'm just going to direct. I know, sort of like, I think we'll probably put a link down in the YouTube, on our YouTube, the YouTube video that's sort of like linked to the other workshop on the equal pay standard. But and also we'll probably put a link also to, this is where you can actually purchase the standard. I think it costs maybe around 100 euros, and it's been translated into English, and it's available for purchase and download by anyone. And the thing about it is, it was generated for the Icelandic labor market, so it can't be used anywhere else. But it was written in cooperation with according to international standards. So there's nothing to stop any other country or any other governmental institution to take up the standard and use it as to inspire them to create their own standard and to introduce them in other labor markets. Because this is just such a powerful mechanism to affect change very, very quickly within the pay structures. Just very short on the labor market in Iceland, just so you see where the situation is. And you can see here 2017, the latest figures that I have. The women make up basically 79% of the labor force, and men make up 86%. And this is a ratio that for this century, and really since 1991, we've seen fairly equal representation of women and men in the labor market. And this is, by the way, the highest participation of women in the labor market in Europe, in the OECD, and in the OECD countries. And you can see sort of like where it rises very quickly. So we have for the better part of the 20th century, we have maybe a third of women in the labor market, but while men's participation remains steady at like 80 to 90%. But it only starts to rise in the 80s and the 90s. The 80s, we see what's happening there is that we see the introduction of the parental leave, sort of like the first maternity leave, and frankly, just modernity. Women are going into the labor market. There is always so it's just modernity coming. But the real changes happen in 1991 to 2001, where we see the introduction of universal daycare. At that point, sort of like you see women's participation goes up, and it doesn't go down again because women want to work, and this is sort of like this is the reason for why we can have this high labor force participation. And I often sort of like when I also speak to when I try to talk to people about sort of like why we are doing as well as we are here in Iceland, I always want to emphasize that perhaps the basis for all the changes that we have made is the fact that we have a universal daycare system, because without daycare, you wouldn't see this, you wouldn't see those figures on the right, like you wouldn't see women participating in the labor market. And when you think about it, the absolute key to gender equality is that women have equal access and equal opportunity to access the workplace. That basically financial independence is a key to women's liberation. That's it. It's all about the money. And if society doesn't provide the structures in place for women to get that money, women will never be equal to men in our society. And that's just a sad fact. So if there's one thing sort of like that, and that people should be focusing on, is to make sure that there is universal, affordable daycare available to everyone, to every family. And it's to the benefit not only of women, but obviously also of families as well. So, and you can see how incredibly popular this is in Iceland. So here are two figures. This is from 2017. Again, we have, unfortunately, we're still working on it. We're trying to make it universal access from the age of 1 when our parental leave finishes. It's now only guaranteed from the age of 2. But you see here from the age of 2 to 5, 95.6% of children are in daycare, 4.5% are not, and those this 4 to 5%, there are reasons for that, right? Like, you know, we're talking about these illnesses in the family. Just it's children are children go to daycare, period, to our preschools. And you can see even sort of like, even if universal access is not guaranteed by the age of 1, they have sort of like some counties or like some regions in Iceland do offer sort of like a preschool from the age of 1, and then there are also like private preschools that have opened up for that, you know, gap year. So you can see that already 46.7% of children at the age of 1 and 2 are in preschool. And I have no doubt that sort of like if universal access was guaranteed, that number would go up to 95.6%. As it is for the age of 2. So this is one of the big priorities that we have here in Iceland, is closing the gap between daycare and the parental leave, so which is now being primarily filled by the parents, and I have to say primarily filled by women who are taking time off work to unpaid time from work to take care of their children. Paternity and maternity leave, this is new. This was passed late last year. Parents still each have an independent entitlement to leave for up to 6 months due to a birth, primary adoption, or reception of a child in permanent foster. This means that sort of like the two parents, it's basically like it's divided equally. However, parents can take 6 weeks of their parental leave and give it to the other parents. And from what we have, so I mean, at worst, we're going to have 4.5 months versus 7.5 months, 7.5 months. So. And this is important because what we have seen in Iceland, and all the studies have shown here in the Nordic countries, is that when parental leave or paternity leave is optional, when it is taken from sort of like when it can be transferred to the mothers, men do not take it, period. So like every time Norway actually had an experiment about 20 years ago, they had sort of like they had reduced the amount of time that was allotted to the father and made it into sort of like a common leave, and men just stopped taking it, period. So they reversed the decision and went back. And we've seen this also in Iceland. If parental leave is tied to the father and can't be transferred, men take it, they want it. But there is a social pressure. If it can be transferable, there is incredible social pressure from everyone that they give the leave back. Sorry, even I say this, that they give the leave over to the female partner if they have one, right? So it's important that we have. It's incredibly important. This is also one of the key reasons for where we are now in gender equality, is that we have independent leave for fathers. It's important. And I also really like the way that it's been constructed in the new legislation from last year, that it does start with the presumption of equal division, 6-6, instead of like the way we organized this formally was that we had 3 months tied to each parent and then 3 months like in a common that they could commonly use. But now just the presumption is equality. We start with 6 months and you have to actually physically give away your leave. So that's also sort of like, it's philosophically important. And you can see here how incredibly popular it has been from the very beginning. So in 2000, the first legislation that basically gave 3 months that gives equal parental leave tied to the fathers, that they can't be transferred. You can see the first year, 82% of fathers took that leave. And you see this curve down here. This is due to the financial crisis, right? This is when families are in financial difficulties. At the same time, what is going on, and this is also something we have to be aware of now in time of COVID. There are cutbacks in public funds, and one of the cutbacks was that they actually reduced the amount of money that was available in the parental leave fund. So it became more financially problematic for many families to actually take the leave than before. So it's been one of our priorities to also to make sure that this fund is enough to actually make it financially viable for families of all genders to take that leave. And as you can see here in 2017, we're still waiting for like good figures from that. The fund is again it is going down, and it's a danger. We want this back up to 85-90%. But again, 77% is just when you compare it to other countries, it's amazing. And it's important because it does have this impact on family life itself. It makes men a part of the family. It makes men more active in doing the unpaid work that otherwise falls on the burden of women, and it permanently shifts the social structures within our homes. Here is again the gender income inequality in Iceland. I'm going to now burst your bubble into sort of like how Iceland is a paradise and how it's not. So when you look at this is sort of like in the middle figure, the unadjusted gender pay gap. This is the one that's used by, for example, the European Bureau of Statistics. It says 15.3% is the adjusted gender pay gap. And then the economists, they sort of like the figure on the very left, 3.6%, they say this is the unexplained gender pay gap. They say, this is the this is sort of like when they took all the factors into account, they can only not explain for 3.6%. So this is the real gender pay gap. We vehemently disagree because when you look at the figures, they're like, this is the figure that I want to look at, 26%, and this is the total earnings gap of 2018. This is the income gap. This is the brutto income gap. When you look at just the pay track, or like the income of women that women are receiving in their bank accounts every month compared to men, the division is 26%. And so reasons for that are, for example, women work shorter hours than men, not because they're lazier, it's because they're doing more unpaid work for society. They're doing more, they're taking the brunt of the care work in the families. Women are taking, and they're taking leave. So it's also a fact that women work in professions where which tend to be more lower paid than male professions. These are, for example, care work is getting less money than construction work, and this is a social problem that we sort of like haven't been able to address. And also there is and there is obviously then direct discrimination, which a tool like the equal pay standard is meant to address. So it's just an interesting figure. So you look at those three figures of like, you know, how economists magically explain away all the gender pay gap and say it's only 3.6% in Iceland, sort of like the unadjusted one is 15.3, but the income gap in total is 26%. And this is the figure that we need to look at if we want to change society, because we have to change the whole picture. We can't look at just a part of the solution. The solution needs to be like equal money, period, right? So why, but I want to answer my talk about sort of like why are we where we are today, and it's because of grassroots actions, because of actions like the women where I started my lecture, who were active in the women's movement at the time, and then decided to form their own political parties, their own labor unions. They ran for offices and they got into offices, started changing things from the inside. Women in Iceland have gone on strike 6 times to demand equal pay in 1975, 85, 2005, 2010, 2016, and 2018. 90% of women in Iceland left work on October 24th, 1975, which was the original women's strike. And by the way, if you look at the year 1975, it's very important to remember that in 7 years later, women start forming their own political parties and running for office again. And interviews with that women, like when we interview those women, they got to know each other during organizing for the original women's strike, right? By organizing for this huge grassroots action that was on a national level, you got women plotting, right? Like you got women organizing together, and they kept on organizing once the original action was taken, and used that organizing to get into positions of power, to start making effective changes on the political level. Yes, this is, and of course the latest women's strike was in 2018. That one was on Me Too. This is a huge reverberating event that is raising, finally breaking through into the wider conversation on the importance of discussing violence against women in Iceland. Is still ongoing. We're now, I think, in the 3rd Me Too wave. So we're actually seeing real effective change sort of like going on in terms of violence. And Me Too is important because it allows us to talk about violence in the workplace. So this is don't change women, change the world. This was the motto of the strike of 2018. Yeah, okay, and I see, because I just love this sort of like timeless video. This is sort of like the strike in Reykjavik of 2018. So mass action definitely works, I have to tell you. Just a quick, because I can't have a feminist talk without talking about violence just a little bit, but sort of like we've done huge studies on violence, and here in this gender paradise that is 88% equal, you can see this is a huge problem. 33% of women in Iceland have been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted at work or in school. 25% of women report having been sexually assaulted, and 25% report having been physically assaulted. This is not the number of women that have actually sought help or justice for this assault. Like we don't have 25% of women going to the hospital after following an assault. These are numbers that we find when we do these huge studies where we actually go out and ask women, sort of like people often ask about the, I didn't even know it was a thing, but sometimes people ask me about the Icelandic paradox. Why are we so good at gender equality but so bad at violence against women? And I was so shocked when I heard they call it the Icelandic paradox in some cases. And I think sort of like it's not a paradox. I think what is going on here is that we are now at that point that we are now looking for those numbers instead of waiting for women to come and report us and then sort of like passively report this as the scope of the problem like most countries do. We now are actively looking for the real scope of the problem. So you have like the universities in Iceland, they're doing these huge studies where 20-30% of women in the country actually participate in, to ask them for the real figure. So that's why we're getting these numbers, because we're finally getting at the truth. If you had asked us 10 years ago, those numbers would have been much lower. But but even of the cases that do end up being reported, there is a huge problem with how it's being, what happens in the justice system. So this is sort of like these are during the years 2008 and 2009, where there was a study done on what happened to cases that were reported to police, what happened to them in the justice system. Is really instructive to see sort of like, the disparity. So you see, of the 189 cases of sexual violence reported to police during those 2 years, 88 were referred to the state prosecutor, who issued 31 charges against individuals, of whom 23 were convicted. So you see 23 convictions out of 189 cases that are reported. And as we've discussed, so many more that are unreported. During the same period, the Rape Crisis Center in Landsbygden, like the Rape Crisis Center, the largest one in the country, reported 248 visits of victims of sexual violence, and individuals sought counseling regarding 463 cases at Stigamot, an NGO that does, does educating and counseling. And so, and then of course I added the last one because it's so ironic, you see, and the official capacity of the prison system in Iceland is 172. So you can see, even if we only take all the cases that end up being reported to the police, not to the doctors, and not to sort of like independent NGOs, and not to the cases that are never reported anywhere except to friends or even just to yourself. Even if we just take the cases that go to the police, we would explore, like, we would not be able to fit them into our prison system. So it is a huge problem. It's a systemic problem, and until we face that, we will never be an equal society. So again, also, I want to just emphasize also at the end that our new equality legislation in 2020 is intersectional and inclusive. It includes 3 genders, because we now have 3 legal genders in Iceland. It also emphasizes the fact that we need to have value diversity and intersectional areas of discrimination, because in the end, sort of like, if we just focus on the issue of women, we will not change society to become a more equal society. We need to focus on all areas of discrimination. Also, this is a slide that ended up this morning because I was just thinking about it. I was speaking with a board member in my organization, like how we're going to change the world, and she said, so like her favorite quote was this one by Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And if you look at the history of Iceland, it really does show that. So like, you can start with a small group of women that bring in more women, and until you suddenly have a national movement that actually does change society. And when you think about it, in a very short period of time, like, it's only been 40 years since we had 5% representation in parliament, and in 40 years we've gone from there to where we are now. So if it, like, once change starts, it can take a very quick, it can go very rapidly, and it will go very rapidly. But and as I was googling this, I found sort of like, and I was like, oh, this is a really interesting quote, I'm going to read more about it. And I found sort of like a change that I think is much more impactful. And it says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed, organized citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And this points to the importance of an organized women's movement, an organized feminist movement, and the importance of all of us to be active in the women's movement and to be active in organizing for change, right? It's so yeah, mass protests are well and good. They can serve as pressure points, but you need organization to get it off the ground, and you need organization following the mass protest to make sure that the changes that are necessary do take place afterwards. So I want to end my talk by saying, support a strong and vibrant feminist movement. Basically, become active in your local feminist group, and if you can't actively participate, support them with money, because we need money to actually do our work, and it's incredibly important. So. And I've seen, that is the end. Thank you. I'm going to stop my share. I hope we have maybe a couple of minutes to talk, because I keep adding to those slides. Waiting on stuff here.
Thank you very much. It was so inspiring as always when you talk. I loved it, and it's really, really nicely. I mean, I love. Lana is giving you hearts. Okay, so Ah, everybody clapping. Nice.
Hey, all right, but joining the
Yay.
conversation. Sorry, I do tend to go on when I start talking about this, but like in the end, sort of like it is about a conversation. And thankfully, we had to change the schedule to make mine the last talk instead of the first. That gives us some leeway.
Yeah. Okay, I see we have some questions. Am I correct, Natasha?
Okay, sorry about that. My neighbors are redecorating, so it's a bit noisy. Can you hear me right now? Because
Yeah, we can.
balcony right now. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I'm also from CESI, and I wanted to ask you maybe to share more my concern, because you said in one of your slides that equality comes with equal representation, and you showed us those slides when the number of laws and policies change when you had equal representation. And what is actually my concern is how is it, and I would like to hear your opinion on that, how is that connected with your social context? Because when I'm thinking about Croatia and how patriarchal and conservative society we are, I'm really not sure whether the equal representation will be really equals gender equality, if you know what I mean. Because we all consider you as Nordic countries as some kind of a gender equality paradise where all women are feminists, and that's why you probably have all those changes introduced. But here in Croatia, I'm really concerned whether we would have those changes introduced if we had equal representation. So I was thinking if you can share some of your, I don't know, opinions, thoughts about that. And I will mute myself because of
Yeah, it's a very thorny problem, and it's I think it's a complex problem, but how can I articulate it? It's still important, but that being said, if we have two nominees for any office, and one of them is a feminist man, and the other one is a social conservative woman, I would always vote for the feminist man, period. I will vote for the person with the ideas that with the plans and ideas to create a progressive feminist social justice society. However, by having women in office who are who have other opinions that we do, that have more socially conservative opinions, can also be impactful, right? Because the fact that you are seeing that means that people are seeing in parliament women at the highest level of power, which is really antithetical to what some social conservatives think, that women should not have power, but by having a woman in high office, it does mean something, even if it's just inspirational, but it means something sort of like to the children growing up in that society, seeing women. So it can be of a benefit. And in the end, the changes that we have made in Iceland were only possible by working together with all political parties, even the socially conservative ones, because you can't change a society if you only work within one party. Then you become then you end up in a situation like you have in the United States, when one party is considered to be sort of like for women's rights, and then the other one says, oh, I don't have to be for women's rights because that's the other party's thing. I'm just going to be against women's rights. You can't have that. You can't fall into that trap. We need to make sure that gender equality becomes something that is near and dear to the heart of every single political party, even if they want to go about it in very different ways. So we do have social conservatives in Iceland, don't get me wrong, but and they also claim, well, they also say, and they say that they're fighting for women's rights, but they do it in different ways. So for example, there is a party now in our parliament that wants to fight for women's rights by having by increasing parental leave. For example, they also wanted to increase parental leave to 12 months, as we did last year, but they wanted to make it 12 months that has 3 divisions, because that would be of most benefit to women, because women could then claim more leave. So they claimed so, and it's important that and I disagree with what they wanted to do. I think I think in the majority of the parliament thankfully agreed with me, was that the way to go was to frame it as having equal division between the two parents. But the fact that we are now, that our social conservative parties are now in line with us, at least in the very ideal of gender equality, means that we have been able to make effective change. So. And we can see that many of the key pieces of legislation that have been passed in the past 20 years in Iceland have been passed, or have been proposed by parties that are on the right, whether they're on the social right or on the economic right, or like the libertarian right. So, for example, the equal pay standard was the legislation that got it in, made it mandatory, was a proposal, or was passed through by a government that was that was libertarian, that was on the right, sort of like on the free market side of things. And the original equal parental leave, it actually came from the center-right center-right party, right? Like, so we've managed to change things in Iceland so that it became that gender equality became a concern of every party in parliament. I am too young to know how it was before, when we were facing the similar situation as we have in Croatia, I think, and in many other countries in Europe. I do know that the year when I was born in 1978, we still had priests, or I guess ministers. We have a Lutheran church, ministers who were like going on public interviews and talking about how women have smaller brains than men and couldn't join, so like that's why they shouldn't be elected to office. So I don't actually know what I don't know how, unfortunately, I don't know how we got from there to where we are now. But in my opinion, sort of like, it's just important to keep in mind that obviously, yes, we vote for progressive feminist change, despite of the gender of the person, in fact of the change. But even if it is a social conservative woman, we need to find ways to connect with them and to sort of like understand them, and sort of, because in the end we can only affect sustainable change if we get everyone on board, if everyone is invested. You can't have just one part of the country invested. And yeah, but it's hard.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like you have, I don't know what I need to think about it, but it seems like it's also, it became a standard. It doesn't matter of, you know, which part of the political arena you are in, but it seems like that it became standard, and it became gender equality, as you said. You know, this was so nice to hear when you said when you are actually studying gender equality, gender studies, then you have the more actually chances in the labor market. But yeah, suddenly it became.
Yeah, and I think sort of like what I want to emphasize, and I know sometimes I sound like I come from another planet. I know
you are.
I've given this talk to other countries, and people look at me and they go like, but that I want to emphasize again, it takes such a short time. We're talking about 40 years since, less than 40 years that you go from 5% representation to 40% representation. It takes, when I was at university in the, I'm last century, because it's 97 to 2000 years, last century. When I was at university, we founded like a club that was really interesting, because we were the first organization. The student club was the first organization that used the word feminist in the title, because feminism in 2000 in Iceland was a bad word. That's 20 years ago, and it so. Yeah, and but it seems sort of like, so in 40 years, we've moved from that to where we are now. So you can see how once change starts happening, and the change in Iceland, it really started happening in 2009 with the social unrest, and with the new people being elected into office, people being willing to try new things. And we have seen that since, like, since the ball started rolling, you know how when you throw sort of like a ball down a hill and it goes down slowly and then goes really, really quickly. It has really been the past decade here in Iceland has been like that. So like change becomes ever quicker every year as gender equality becomes more ingrained into the political and the social, framework of our society. So but it took 110 years of 150 years, because it didn't start, the like organized feminist work or like women's rights work started in the 19th century when the first women's societies were being formed. It took over a century of incredibly hard, unpaid, thankless work by all these countless of women who were working on these small changes that they got through with very great difficulty and didn't see changes like the changes necessary in their lifetime or the effects of those changes in their lifetimes. But sort of like at some point it all comes together, and sort of like, and once it starts, it is my firm belief that it will happen quickly. However, this being said, we need to be careful. We saw what happened in the last elections in Iceland. It can't go sort of like the gains that people have made can be taken away quickly with a rise of new. And we see what's happening in other countries in Europe. There is a rise of illiberal democracy. There is a rise of far-right forces, of anti-gender forces, of forces that are misogynist. And one of the reasons, for example, that we were thinking of one of the reasons that we focused on changing or updating our abortion law and our parental leave law in the past couple of years was because we are afraid that those forces are going to come to Iceland as well. So, for example, our abortion legislation was from 1975. It basically was very liberal in the way it was practiced. It said that women could get abortions if they got written permission from a committee of doctors and social workers. And in practice, for 45 years, it had worked. Like women had gone and they automatically got the permission to get the abortion that they needed. However, in a society, if those forces, that is a legislation that is very easy to abuse if a government comes into power that is actively against women's rights to choose. So it was important for us to make sure that the rights of women to have an abortion was enshrined in our legislation as absolute before any of those forces got into power in Iceland. So that's why. So yeah, it does. I mean, none of the gains that we have made are guaranteed. We can always go back. There is always going to be need for an organization like ours. There's always going to be need for feminist activism. There's always going to be need for international cooperation, because Iceland doesn't remain gender equal and progressive for a very long time if the rest of the world falls into illiberal democracy. It's important for us to work very closely with organizations in Croatia and other parts of Europe to make sure that we as a continent and we as a world combat these issues together, and to sort of like make sure that we eradicate inequality everywhere.
True. Here to that. Okay, I see it's 6:30 past almost. So are there any more questions? Or
no, I just wanted to say, Bryn, wow, I really loved your presentation, and I agree with everything you said. So much great quotes, laws written by men, vision of legislative patriarchy, always have to be on the ground. I mean, I don't even know, I'm going to rewatch this like 5 times because I really liked it, and especially the part when you talk about women in politics. I think it's really important, and I agree with everything you said. Really with everything, so thank you very much. I mean,
you have a fan.
No, I really loved it. Yeah. I wanted to just touch upon about gender quotas in companies, but we can discuss it on another occasion because it's already late. But just really thank you so much, so much. I love it. And all of this grassroots organization and women organizing, it really, touched my heart. I really hope that in Croatia we can have like this, grassroots feminist sisterhood that really, makes real change. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Lana.
Okay, after Lana, anybody else? No?
I don't know, maybe I
Amelia,
can
no?
say also thank you for this part about women in politics. You know, it's a so old story in Croatia. I remember over 20 years ago when we really worked with all political parties, but we didn't learn this important lesson. Work with all representatives, because we need to send this picture, 50% of women faces and 50% of male faces. It's a way of very good political message and communication we need in our society to learn, to remember how we start our work. Thank you so much on this part. It was brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Or we are closing the session.
Closing the session. Okay. Oh, I have to meet. I feel like I need to meet you every day. I feel so happy now. I'm going to walk out into the rainy day, not the sunshine, with a smile in my heart.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, it was very nice. Okay, everyone. See you. Who will come on Friday? We will have the talk with Tatiana in Croatian, because she's from this part of the world, and we will talk about her perception of work and feminist engagement on Iceland. See ya. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Uh-huh.